Now, one thing I really like is this deployment overview. When you do create a resource, it basically shows you all of the items that are being created, and you can just sort of watch it. This deployment took 4 minutes and 41 seconds, so under 5 minutes to get a virtual machine created, including a network interface card and a public IP address and a network security group. So there's a number of resources that are being created. I'm going to click the Go To Resource button. Now, before we review the actual resource itself, let's look at the resource group. Now, I do have 2 virtual machines in this resource group. Remember, I said that a resource group is a folder that contains resources. It's an organizational structure that basically allows your Azure portal and Microsoft Azure itself not to get too crazy with the hundreds of resources. I have 2 virtual machines in here. That means 2 data disks, 2 network interface cards, 2 network security groups, 2 IP addresses, 2 virtual machines, and 1 virtual network. Okay, so that's 2 VMs and a virtual network within the same resource group. Now, let's go down here. We can see the virtual machine type AZ203 new VM2. So that's the VM that we created. It's running a Windows operating system, the B1MS size that we expected. Like I said, it has a public IP address, so we can access this by IP address. Now, if the IP address is awkward for you, you can always give a fully qualified domain name. So I go into the IP address, you'll see that there's a domain that's .centralus.cloudapp.azure.com. So I can always say AZ new VM2 and basically save this, and this IP address will then have this fully qualified name if that's what we want. Okay. Let's go back to the virtual machine. So now there's nothing running on this machine. It's a brand new install. And so if you visited this IP address using your browser, well, we did open up port 80, so it would attempt to connect to that machine, but there's nothing listening on the other end. We don't have this machine configured as a web server. To do that, we go to this connect button here at the top. And depending on whether it's a Windows or a Linux virtual machine, we're going to get instructions for connecting to it using either RDP or SSH. With RDP, you will connect to it using its public IP address over port 3389. Remember that we opened port 3389 in order for our public internet, which is what we're on, in order to connect to this VM. We can go right to the RDP file, which is a file that you can download and you can actually use to connect to this virtual machine. Now, I'm not going to be able to log into this machine as myself. I have to say more choices and use a different account. Remember when we created this virtual machine, we gave it a user ID and password. I'm not going to give you mine, but you'll hopefully remember that you created a user ID and password for admin credentials when you created this virtual machine. So you enter your admin credentials and say OK. Now this is the first time we're connecting to this virtual machine, and there's no way to verify this identity. We don't recognize it. Okay, the certificate says the certificate is not trusted by certifying authority. So we do have to accept this certificate despite the errors. Now we can see that RDP is connecting. This just like you would have a server on your own network that you're connecting to RDP. The first time you'll log into it, it has to set up your user profile, so there's a lot of desktop related things going on. Okay, I'm going to pause the video while this is going on, and then we can come back and we'll set this up as a web server just for fun.